The midday sun burned mercilessly on the packed auction yard, but no one felt its heat more than Leora as she stood on the wooden block, her wrists bound in front of her, rope biting into skin already raw from the morning's struggle. The boards under her bare feet were hot enough to sting, yet it was the welt above her collarbone that seared deepest. A fresh, black-inked word burned into her pale flesh, with a branding iron still cooling in the sheriff's office. Property. The letters were crude, the mark uneven, but it glistened wet and ugly, as if the humiliation could still scald her from the inside. Around her the crowd pressed closer, eager for the show. Men shaded their eyes to get a better look. Women pretended to avert their gaze but whispered behind their fans. A boy in a straw hat pointed and laughed, only to be hushed by his father. Somewhere behind the milling bodies, a dog barked and was silenced with a boot. The auctioneer, a rangy man with a patchy beard and a voice sharpened by years of shouting over livestock, paced beside her like a trader showing off a prime bull. "Fine stock here, gentlemen," he called, catching her by the arm and turning her so everyone could see the mark. Blonde hair, blue eyes, strong frame, knows basic cooking and sewing, though I'll admit she's got a temper when riled. That drew a ripple of laughter. Someone shouted, "How's she in obedience?" And the auctioneer smirked. "Limited," he said, "but with the right hand, she'll be manageable." The crowd laughed harder this time, the sound bouncing off the clapboard buildings and sinking like lead into Leora's chest. She kept her head low, hair falling forward to hide the shame burning on her cheeks. Every word felt like another shove toward a life she had not chosen, and she wondered, not for the first time, if this was how she would end, sold, worked, and forgotten. "Let's start at $10 for the blonde," a voice called from the front. "Half that," another jeered. "She's already spoiled." The words hit harder than the branding iron. Leora's pulse roared in her ears, each beat a drum counting down to the moment she would vanish into the hands of someone who saw her as nothing more than a transaction. She didn't notice him at first. He was taller than most, his shoulders blocking the noon light, a broad hat casting his face in shadow. He didn't push or shout. He simply stepped forward from the back, his movement so deliberate it bent the air in the yard. The crowd's noise faltered, then thinned to a murmur. Even the auctioneer paused mid-breath, his practiced patter stalling for the first time all morning. Leora risked a glance up. Dark eyes met hers, eyes like wet earth after rain, holding no cruelty, no gloating. They dropped to the mark on her collarbone, and for a long moment he didn't move, as though reading a language only he understood. Then, without warning, he stepped to the platform, one hand reaching up. The rope around her wrists gave a short, sharp tug as he pulled her toward him, but before she could stumble, his other arm came around her waist. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. Gasps rippled through the yard. A hat tipped back. A woman's hand flew to her mouth. "She's mine," he said, quietly, but the words carried, rolling through the stillness like distant thunder. The auctioneer stared, his mouth open, looking from the stranger to the murmuring crowd, unsure if the day's sale had just ended, or if it had only truly begun. The man who held her stepped down from the auction block with the ease of someone stepping off a porch, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy finality that seemed to pull the air out of the yard. And Leora, still reeling from the sting of the branding and the mockery of the crowd, could only register the sheer size of him now that he stood in the open sunlight. He was massive, his shadow wrapping over her like a shield, his broad chest rising and falling with a slow, unhurried breath that made the restless onlookers fall strangely silent. And as he moved, men shifted aside not from politeness, but because something in his stance carried the weight of a man who had never once been told where he could or could not walk. His face, free of the brim's shadow, was carved in strong lines, his skin tanned and wind-worn, the hint of a scar tracing from his temple to the ridge of his cheekbone, his eyes dark and steady in a way that stripped away the noise of the moment and made her heart slam hard against her ribs. And though she should have fought him, scratched, kicked, begged, there was nothing in his grip that spoke of ownership. It was steady, anchored, the kind of hold a man took when he intended to keep harm at bay. "You can't just walk off with her," the auctioneer barked, scrambling down after them, his voice cracking like it had found courage too late. "She ain't been paid for." The giant didn't break stride, didn't even spare him a glance as he answered, "She's paid for." And though the words were few, they hit the auctioneer like a ledger slammed shut, as if some old, unseen account had just been balanced in front of God and everyone. Leora's pulse raced as they reached the rail where a tall bay horse stood tethered, the animal's flanks glistening, its ears flicking back at the approaching tension, and with a strength that belied how easily he moved. The man set her onto the saddle as though she weighed no more than the shawl that had been stripped from her earlier. He held the rope, still binding her wrists, not cruelly, but enough to keep her from doing something reckless. And as he adjusted the stirrups, she found her voice, hoarse and trembling. "Why?" she asked, the single word tasting of dust and disbelief. He looked up, his gaze locking with hers in a way that rooted her to the moment. "Because no one brands a woman like cattle." The sentence was a hammer blow, not for its sharpness, but for how it seemed to see every hidden wound she'd carried long before this day. And before she could speak, a ripple of movement broke the fragile space between them. Two men in trail-dusted coats pushed through the yard, their eyes fixed on her like hawks on a rabbit. One of them jabbing a finger forward with a voice that cracked through the murmurs. "That's her! Stop him!" they shouted, and the crowd stiffened, suddenly torn between the spectacle they'd just witnessed and the trouble now cutting toward it. The giant's jaw tightened, and in one fluid motion he swung into the saddle behind her, his left arm bracing her against the horn as the bay shifted under their combined weight, muscles bunching for the run. "Hold on," he murmured low, and before her mind could catch up, the horse surged forward, pounding through the yard with a force that sent townsfolk stumbling aside, shouts and curses tangling in the dust as the open prairie yawned ahead, the sound of boots and pursuit ringing in her ears while the heat of his chest at her back told her one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever he was not about to let them take her back. The pounding of hooves behind them was no bluff. Leora could hear the sharp, desperate rhythm of pursuit closing over the roar of the wind, the shouts of the two men from the yard chasing them hard, and with every jolt of the saddle beneath her, the bindings at her wrists bit deeper. But she didn't dare complain because the giant's arm was the only thing keeping her steady as the bay tore a line across the open ground, weaving between the scrub and stones with the precision of a horse that had been asked to run for its life before. "They'll catch us," she shouted over her shoulder, though her words were half snatched by the wind, and the man behind her leaned just enough for his voice to reach her ear, low and steady like the ground itself was listening. "Not if you sit tight." The first rifle shot cracked, the sound slicing the air above her head and sending a flock of startled crows exploding from the mesquite ahead, their black shapes scattering like smoke against the bright, pitiless sky, and without hesitation, the giant shifted his weight, guiding the bay in a sharp angle that flung her to the side, the world tilting as dirt sprayed up in a hot wave. They cleared a dry arroyo in a single leap, the impact rattling her teeth, and when she dared glance back, the two men had been forced to slow, their mounts scrambling down the cut before clawing up the far side. It bought them a few breaths, but not more. "Why are they after you?" she asked, the question raw, stripped of the defiance she'd tried to wear like armor. "After you," he corrected, and the words chilled her worse than the wind. She wanted to demand answers, but the ground ahead shifted, the slope rising into a ridge where the earth fractured into jagged outcrops, and he leaned forward, urging the horse up. The climb slowed them, and behind, the pursuit's rhythm grew clearer again, pounding up the trail they'd carved. At the ridge's crest, the land dropped away in a steep, stony descent into a narrow canyon where a trickle of water wound through willows, and without breaking stride, the giant guided the bay straight down, letting the horse half slide, half step in bursts until they hit the soft earth below. He didn't slow. They followed the creek's winding path, the willows swallowing them in shifting strips of shade, the air cooler here, but thick with the smell of wet earth and crushed green. "You're going to get yourself killed," she said, her voice catching between the thump of her heart and the slap of low branches. "Maybe," he allowed, "but you'd be gone already if that was my aim." Something in his tone, so matter-of-fact, rooted deep, as if he was speaking from a place where choices were made without hesitation, because hesitation was death. Another rifle shot cracked, this time from somewhere high, the sound echoing off the canyon walls, and she ducked instinctively, feeling his arm tighten to keep her from pitching forward. The giant pulled the bay to the right, plunging them into a side channel where the creek narrowed to a path barely wide enough for the horse, forcing him to push through a curtain of reeds that slapped wet against her face and arms. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit wavered, muffled by the canyon's twists, and then were gone entirely, replaced by the rasp of the bay's breathing and the distant drip of water over stone. Only then did he slow, the tension in his frame loosening but not disappearing, and he glanced ahead toward a shadowed gap between two massive slabs of rock. "We'll rest there," he said, guiding the horse toward the darkness, and though every instinct told her not to follow a stranger into shadow, the steady heat of him at her back and the fading shouts behind made it feel, for the first time that day, like the only place in the world that might hold. The moment they passed between the twin slabs, the air changed, dropping cooler as if the heat outside had been a fever, and this narrow throat of stone was the cure. The sounds of the canyon muffled into a hush so complete that Leora could hear the rush of her own blood in her ears. The bay's hooves struck the hard-packed earth with a softer, hollow thud, and she twisted just enough to see the light narrowing behind them until it was a thin blade, severing them from the open land and the men who had been close enough to breathe down their necks moments ago. But the giant cowboy didn't pause to savor safety, his hand steady on the reins, his other still anchored around her middle with that same immovable grip that had both steadied and trapped her since the moment he'd hauled her from the dirt in front of the jeering crowd. The path wound deeper into the rock, the ceiling pressing low in places so they had to bow their heads, and she could smell the mineral damp of stone untouched by sun, mingled with the faintest hint of smoke that made her tense. Smoke meant people, and people here could mean anything. The giant seemed to read her shift because his voice came low, almost lazy, but it threaded steel through the cool air. "They won't follow us in here, not if they've got any sense." And when she asked why, he simply said, "Because they can't afford to disappear." A phrase that rolled in her mind like a stone in a pocket, smooth but heavy. The gap widened abruptly into a hollowed basin, the roof splitting open to let a shaft of bright daylight spear down onto a flat patch of earth, where someone had built a small camp. Nothing more than a ring of stones blackened by fire and a log split lengthwise into a bench. But its existence here, hidden from the world, told her this wasn't the first time he'd vanished into the rock. He swung down from the saddle with the same easy strength he'd used to lift her in the street, then reached up for her, his big hands closing around her waist and setting her down, as if she weighed no more than a child. And though the crowd's mocking laughter still echoed in her ears, the ease with which he handled her sent a strange, unfamiliar ache through her chest. She stepped back automatically, feeling the stone wall firm against her spine, while he led the bay to a shadowed corner where a trickle of water slid down the rock into a shallow pool, letting the horse drink. "You know them?" she asked, meaning the men with the rifles, but his answer, "I know what they are paid to do," only deepened the knot in her stomach, and she pushed. "And what am I to them?" He looked over his shoulder, the brim of his hat tilting just enough for her to see his eyes, pale as sun-washed sky, but shadowed with something unreadable, something they think they own. The word own snagged in her like a thorn, making her swallow hard, and before she could demand he explain, a soft sound came from deeper in the basin, a rustle in the shadows like cloth against stone, and the giant's gaze cut that way sharp enough to slice the air. He took 2 slow steps toward it, his hand dropping to the worn grip of the revolver at his hip, and Leora's heart slammed against her ribs as a figure emerged. Not one of the men from the chase, but a boy no more than 12, barefoot, his shirt hanging in tatters, eyes wide and fixed not on her, but on the man beside her. "You're late," the boy said in a voice that trembled between relief and accusation, and the giant's reply, "Had to pick up something they tried to throw away," sent a fresh wave of questions tearing through her mind, none of which she trusted herself to ask out loud. Not yet. Not here. Leora stared at the boy, trying to piece together how a child could be waiting here in a hidden basin in the middle of the canyon, his bare feet smudged with dust, hair falling in his eyes, shoulders thin but squared like someone who'd learned early not to flinch. The giant cowboy moved first, handing the reins of the bay to the boy with a quiet, "Water him again," as if this exchange were routine, and the boy obeyed without a glance at her, leading the horse toward the pool while she stood caught between the stone walls and the man who had upended her day. "Who is he?" she asked, voice sharper than intended, but the giant didn't answer right away, instead stepping to the fire ring, squatting to stir the cold ashes with a stick, like checking the remnants of someone else's story. And when he did speak, it was in that slow, deliberate tone that made her lean in to catch each word. "He's the reason I'm still breathing." The boy, kneeling by the water, shot him a look that held more weight than a child's glance should, and then his eyes slid to her for the first time, assessing, wary. "They were waiting for you," the boy said, and she realized he meant the men who had chased them through the street. "And they saw her." The giant's jaw tightened, and he came to stand beside her, his shadow folding over hers. "They'll think you're a debt," he said simply, which made no sense until the boy's next words cracked something open. "They trade people, miss, like cattle, like sacks of grain, and the ones they can't sell they use to keep others in line." Heat surged in her face, not from the sun but from the memory of the crowd's laughter, the mayor's smirk when she'd stumbled on the boardwalk, the way someone had whispered, "too big," like it was a crime. "So I'm leverage?" she said, testing the word, and the boy nodded grimly. The giant finally looked at her fully, eyes steady. Not anymore. She wanted to demand what gave him the right to decide that, but there was no mockery in his tone, only fact, as if he were stating the time of day. The boy stood, wiping his hands on his trousers, and tossed a folded scrap of paper toward the giant, who caught it one-handed and opened it to reveal crude lettering in black ink. Names, dates, numbers, none of which meant anything to her, until he tapped one name with his thumb. "Yours," he said, and she felt her breath snag. "How?" she began, but the boy interrupted. "They keep ledgers, all the ones they mark." And her mind spun back to the burn she'd felt on her shoulder when one of the men had gripped her in the street, his hand lingering not in insult, but in some ugly sort of inspection. The giant tucked the paper into his vest, then motioned for them both to follow him deeper into a narrow split in the basin wall she hadn't noticed before. "We can't stay here," he said. "They'll check the gap by nightfall," and, without waiting for agreement, he ducked into the shadows, the boy close on his heels. Leora hesitated only a breath before stepping after them, the stone cool under her fingertips as they passed into a tunnel that smelled faintly of sage and something metallic. The dark pressed close until a pinprick of light ahead widened into a sliver, then a slice, and they emerged onto a ledge high above a second canyon floor where the wind rushed past her ears like an unbroken chorus. Far below, a string of riders picked their way along the creek bed, rifles slung across their backs, and when one of them glanced up, the giant stepped in front of her so swiftly she barely saw the movement, his body shielding hers completely as he murmured, "They don't get to see you again." And for the first time since he'd lifted her into the saddle, she believed he meant it. The ledge was narrow enough that Leora could feel the emptiness drop away beneath her boots. And though her heart stuttered at the height, it was the giant cowboy's stillness that kept her from stepping back into the dark passage. His shoulders were squared like a wall, blocking the view of the riders below, but she could hear their voices, low and sharp, carried up in fragments by the wind, searching, cursing, one of them laughing in a way that made her skin crawl. The boy crouched low beside her, fingers gripping the rock, and whispered, "They'll split soon, some to the basin, some to the road." And the giant gave the barest nod. Leora swallowed against the dryness in her throat, realizing the three of them were pressed into a sliver of safety that might not last an hour, and she forced herself to whisper, "Why are they after you?" The giant didn't look back, but his voice was quieter than she'd heard it yet. "Because I took something they think they own?" And though she wanted to ask what, the boy's glance stopped her. It was a warning, or maybe a plea, and she realized some answers weren't meant to be forced in a place where echoes could betray them. Below, the riders began to scatter, 3 turning toward the far bend, 2 staying in the creek bed, and 1 dismounting to kneel by the water's edge as if reading tracks. The giant moved then, shifting sideways along the ledge, and she had no choice but to follow, the boy behind her, the stone scraping her shoulder when the wall narrowed. After several long minutes, they reached a jut of rock, where the ledge widened just enough to reveal a steep trail curling down into a pocket of green she hadn't expected. Cottonwoods clustered around a spring, their leaves trembling in the sunlight. "We'll water here, quick," the giant said, and it struck her that he gave orders the way someone gave lifelines, without room for debate. The descent was rough, loose shale slipping underfoot, but the giant's hand was suddenly there, steady at her elbow, and he kept it there until they reached the bottom, where the air was cooler and thick with the scent of damp earth. The boy ran to the spring, filling the canteens, while the giant led the bay to drink. Leora crouched by the water, cupping her hands to drink, and caught her reflection. Dust-streaked, hair falling loose, eyes sharper than she remembered seeing them. "You said they think I'm a debt," she murmured without looking up. "What kind of debt needs a ledger?" The giant's gaze met hers across the horse's back, unreadable, the kind they collect in blood if coin fails. A shiver ran through her, not from the cool water, but from the way the boy glanced away again, as if that truth was too common to linger on. "If we keep east," the giant continued, "we can cross into land they won't follow." And though she didn't know what land he meant, the certainty in his tone wrapped around her like the shadow of something vast and solid. The boy handed her a canteen, his eyes flicking to the path they'd come down, and she followed his look to see movement far above, tiny silhouettes cresting the ledge. "They're tracking faster than I thought," the giant said, swinging into the saddle and pulling her up in one motion that stole her breath, the bay snorting as if sensing the urgency. The boy climbed up behind her, his small hands clutching her waist for balance, and the giant kicked the horse into a gallop that sent branches whipping past them as they threaded through the cottonwoods. The trail bent sharply, and for a heartbeat they were in open sun, the canyon walls rising on either side before plunging into a tunnel of red stone where the hoofbeats boomed like drums. The boy leaned forward to shout over the wind, "If we reach the split, they'll have to guess which way we went." The giant didn't answer, but the speed didn't falter, and Leora found herself gripping the saddle horn, eyes watering from the rush, until the tunnel spit them out onto a flat stretch of high desert where the horizon seemed to shimmer with heat. Far behind, the riders burst from the canyon mouth, a flicker of motion against the stone, and she felt the giant shift his weight, angling toward a ridge that rose like the spine of some sleeping beast. "Hold on," he said, and the bay surged up the slope, each stride carrying them further from the shouts that now rose behind them like a tide, until the wind swallowed every sound but the pounding of the horse's heart beneath her. By the time they reached the crest, Leora's legs ached from holding on, and her hands were numb from gripping the saddle horn. But the giant cowboy didn't slow until they were hidden behind a line of boulders that jutted like broken teeth along the ridge. The wind here was fiercer, carrying the taste of dust and the faint metallic tang of distant rain. And when she glanced back, she could see the riders spreading across the desert floor below, some angling toward the canyon they'd just escaped, others fanning wide to catch their trail. The boy slid down first, scanning the horizon with an intensity that didn't match his years, and murmured, "They'll try to box us in before night." The giant dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel, and reached up to steady Leora as she slid to the ground, his touch firm but brief. "We rest the horse 5 minutes, no more," he said, leading the bay into the shadow of the rocks. Leora followed, every muscle still taut with the urgency of flight, and crouched beside the boy, who was drawing lines in the dirt with a stick, crude shapes of the land, arrows pointing to gaps she couldn't see. "The ridge narrows here," he explained, tapping one spot. "If we get there first, they can't ride in numbers." The giant knelt beside him, nodding once, and added, "But if they beat us, they'll pin us against the drop." Leora swallowed, imagining the sheer cliffs they'd been skirting, and asked, "Why risk the ridge at all?" The giant's eyes met hers, and there was no softness in them now, only the weight of a truth he'd been carrying too long. "Because beyond it is the only place they won't follow." She almost asked why again, but something in the way the boy's hand tightened on the stick told her the answer wasn't for now. Instead, she leaned back against the warm stone, letting the wind cool the sweat on her neck, and for a moment the silence between them was almost a comfort. Then, faint but distinct, came the echo of hoofbeats from the far side of the ridge, and the giant was on his feet instantly, striding to the edge to peer down. "2 of them took the north trail," he said, voice low. "They'll be here before sundown." The boy kicked dirt over his drawing, erasing it, and sprang up to help gather the reins. Leora pushed herself up, her knees stiff, and asked, "If we reach the narrow first, what then?" The giant glanced back at her, one brow lifting as if the question had only one possible answer. "Then we make them turn back." He swung into the saddle again, pulling her up after him without effort, the boy scrambling up behind, and they moved out at a steady trot along the spine of the ridge, the land falling away on either side into dizzying drops. The wind tore at her hair, and the horizon seemed endless, but every few moments the giant would glance towards the west, gauging the sun's slow descent. They passed patches of scrub and clusters of prickly pear, the silence broken only by the bay's breathing and the occasional cry of a hawk wheeling above. After nearly an hour, the ridge narrowed to a strip no wider than the horse's stride, the rock worn smooth by centuries of wind. And here the giant slowed to a walk, his eyes scanning every shadow. The boy leaned forward to point toward a jagged outcrop ahead. That's the choke point. Leora could see it now, a place where two massive slabs of stone leaned together to form a gate of sorts, the drop yawning beyond like the mouth of a canyon. As they approached, movement flickered in the corner of her vision. Two riders breaking from cover on the far side, rifles slung but hands ready. The giant's voice was calm, almost too calm. "We're first." And with a squeeze of his knees, he urged the bay into a tight sprint that carried them through the stone gate just as the riders slowed, unwilling to risk the narrow pass. Leora twisted to look back and saw them pulling up, one of them raising a hand to shade his eyes as he watched them disappear beyond the ridge. She turned forward again, the wind burning her cheeks, and for the first time since that morning, the giant allowed a ghost of a smile to cross his face, though it didn't reach his eyes. Beyond the ridge, the land fell away into a hidden basin that seemed carved out of the desert by some forgotten hand. A wide hollow, ringed by steep cliffs and streaked with green, where a narrow river wound like a silver thread. The descent was treacherous, the path zigzagging down loose rock that shifted under the bay's hooves, but the giant cowboy's grip on the reins was steady, his weight leaning just enough to keep the horse balanced, and Leora clung to the saddle horn, while the boy held tight behind her, his breath quick against her back. Halfway down, the wind dropped away and the air grew still, heavy with the scent of sage and damp stone, and she realized they were stepping into a world the riders above might never guess existed. At the base, the river whispered over smooth stones, its banks lined with willows that swayed gently in the stillness, and the giant dismounted, scanning the cliffs before helping her down. "They can't see us here unless they know where to look," he said, leading the bay to drink. And for the first time in hours, Leora's legs felt the ground solid beneath her. The boy crouched at the water's edge, filling the canteens again, while Leora knelt to splash her face, the coolness a shock after the dry heat above. "How did you find this place?" she asked, her voice low, and the giant's answer came after a pause. "A man I trusted showed me, years ago. He's gone now." Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten, and she didn't press for more. Instead, she watched as he walked to a boulder at the base of the cliff, pressing his palm against a section of rock, and to her surprise, a narrow opening appeared, just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. "It's a shelter," the boy said quietly. "He made it when the winters here nearly took him." The giant stepped inside first, the shadows swallowing him, and when Leora followed, she found herself in a shallow cave where the air was cool and faintly smoky, as if fires had burned here long ago. The floor was smooth dirt, the walls etched with faint marks she couldn't read, and in one corner lay a folded blanket and a small bundle wrapped in leather. "This will do for tonight," the giant said, kneeling to spread the blanket, his movements practiced, almost ritual. Leora sank down against the wall, the stone cold through her dress, and felt a strange mix of safety and unease. Safe because the riders couldn't find them here easily. Uneasy because the giant seemed to be holding back more than just words. The boy handed her a canteen, then sat cross-legged across from her, studying her with eyes too knowing for his age. "They won't stop," he said, "not until they think they've made an example." She frowned. "An example of what?" The giant's head lifted, his gaze catching hers in the dim light. "Of anyone who refuses to be owned." The words settled heavy between them, and Leora thought of the way the riders had moved, organized and certain, like they'd done this before. Outside, the sun was sinking, shadows creeping higher on the cliffs, and the giant stood to check the narrow entrance, his silhouette blocking the last sliver of daylight. "We leave before dawn," he said. "The basin has only 2 ways out, and they'll watch one." Leora wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from the quiet weight of what lay ahead, and wondered if she had stepped into a story that had been running long before she arrived. The boy pulled a small knife from his belt, carving absent lines into a scrap of wood, and she realized the sound of the blade against the grain was the only noise in the cave. The giant moved to sit near the entrance, his rifle across his knees, and when Leora finally let her eyes close, the last thing she saw was the way he sat, not tense, but never truly at rest, listening for echoes in a world that didn't forgive those who stopped moving. The first pale light had barely brushed the top of the cliffs when the giant cowboy's hand was on Leora's shoulder, firm but careful, shaking her from a shallow sleep. The air in the cave was still cool, carrying the faint tang of last night's embers, and the boy was already awake, his knife tucked away, his eyes sharper than the dawn. Outside, the basin was draped in a thin veil of mist rising from the river, making the willows appear ghostly and the rocks soft-edged, as if the world itself wanted to keep them hidden for just a little longer. "We take the east trail," the giant said, his voice low. "The other will be watched." They moved quickly, the boy leading the horse while Leora stayed close behind the giant, her skirt catching on sage branches as they pushed through. The path wound narrow and steep, switchbacking up a side of the basin where loose shale crunched underfoot, and every step risked sliding backward. Halfway up, the sound came, a faint clink of metal against stone, so out of place in the quiet that it seemed to slice the morning in 2. The giant froze, his hand lifted, and the boy stopped mid-step, the horse's ears flicking forward. Another sound followed, heavier now, hoofbeats, slow and deliberate coming from above. Leora's heart kicked hard in her chest, and she glanced toward the giant, whose eyes had gone flat and calculating. Without a word, he pointed toward a narrow cleft in the rock to their left, barely wide enough for them to slip through, and they ducked into the shadow as the hoofbeats grew louder. From their hiding place, Leora could see a sliver of the trail above. 2 riders, rifles slung across their backs, scanning the basin with the casual menace of men who believed no one could outthink them. Their horses clopped past, dust rising in lazy spirals, and the sound faded until it was swallowed by the stillness again. "They're heading for the lower entrance," the boy whispered, and the giant's jaw tightened. "Which means they'll double back." They waited another few minutes before stepping out, moving faster now, the giant taking the lead. When they reached the rim of the basin, the world opened wide, endless scrub and rolling hills, the horizon a wavering line between earth and sky. But there, cutting across it, a thin column of smoke rose from the east, and the giant cursed under his breath. "Signal fire," he said. "They're closing the net." They veered south, staying low among the rocks, the pace punishing, Leora's legs burning but her mind too fixed on the threat behind them to care. By midday, the sun was high and unforgiving, and they reached a ridge where the land dipped into a dry riverbed choked with mesquite. The giant stopped, scanning the distance, then motioned them down into the shade. He pulled a small bundle from his saddlebag, jerked meat, a pouch of water, and a strip of cloth that he handed to Leora. "Wrap your hair and keep low," he said. And when she hesitated, he added, "They're looking for a girl with fire in her hair, not one hidden like dust." She tied it quickly, the boy watching with an approving nod, and they ate in silence, the heat pressing down heavy. After a short rest, they climbed out of the riverbed, only to find the tracks of 3 horses etched fresh into the dust ahead, the prints heading in the same direction they needed to go. The giant crouched, studying them, his fingers brushing the edge of a hoofprint before he looked up, meeting Leora's eyes. "They're trying to drive us," he said, "but they don't know I've been here before." Instead of following the trail, he turned sharply west, leading them into a jagged stretch of badlands where the ground split into gullies and the rocks rose like broken teeth. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long and sharp, and the air cooled just enough to make Leora realize how much her muscles ached. As they wound deeper into the maze, she began to understand. The land here was a labyrinth, and the giant moved through it with the certainty of someone who had learned its every turn the hard way. Still, she caught the way his eyes flicked often to the horizon, as if counting the time left before their luck ran out. And when the first distant echo of a rifle cracked somewhere behind them, she knew that time had just grown short. The rifle shot rolled through the gullies like thunder trapped between the jagged walls, bouncing and bending until it was impossible to tell how close it had come, but the giant cowboy didn't slow. If anything, his long strides quickened, forcing Leora and the boy to match his pace as they slipped deeper into the twisting channels of stone. The air cooler here, but tight with the scent of dust and iron. Above them, the sky was reduced to thin strips of blue between the towering rock faces, and every turn felt like stepping further into the belly of the earth. The bay's hooves struck sparks on the stone as they moved. And once, Leora thought she saw movement high on the ridge, a flicker of sunlight on metal. But before she could speak, the giant had already drawn his rifle, his voice a low command for them to stay close. The next shot came sharper, closer, chipping a shard from the wall near Leora's head, and the sound of hooves followed, the echo bouncing madly through the gullies. The giant swung them into a side passage barely wide enough for the horse, and they scrambled over loose rock until they reached a hollow half hidden by a curtain of thorned mesquite. "In," he ordered, lifting the branches for Leora and the boy, then tying the horse just inside. The hollow opened wider once they were past the thorns, a rough amphitheater of stone with only one way in, the way they had come. And the giant set his rifle on a ledge, eyes scanning the narrow entry. "They'll have to come through single file," he murmured, more to himself than to them, "and that's where we take them." Leora's pulse pounded in her ears, her mouth dry, but the boy had already crouched low beside a rock, his small hands checking the edge of his knife. Minutes passed in a taut silence, broken only by the faint creak of the giant's leather coat as he shifted his aim. Then, from beyond the mesquite, came the soft crunch of hooves and the faint scrape of a spur against stone. A shadow lengthened across the entry, and the first rider eased into view, his rifle lifted, eyes sharp. But he never saw the shot that dropped him from the saddle, the sound cracking like the sky had split. The horse bolted, the rider crumpling to the dust, and the echo hadn't even died before another figure lunged forward, firing blindly into the hollow. The shot shattered against the rock above Leora's head, showering her with grit. But the giant's next bullet struck true, sending the second man sprawling. The third rider hesitated, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. But instead of charging, he wheeled his horse and galloped back the way he'd come, his shouts fading into the maze. The giant didn't lower his rifle until the sound was gone entirely. And even then, he stayed at the entry, his gaze searching the ridges above for any sign of return. Leora knelt beside the first fallen man, her stomach twisting at the sight of the crude iron brand burned into his forearm, a mark she'd seen on others in the town, men who moved with the same ruthless discipline. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and the giant's answer was grim. "Men paid to remind folks who owns the land." He checked the bodies quickly, taking ammunition and a canteen before dragging them outside the hollow and covering them with loose rock. "This will buy us a day, maybe two," he said, "but they'll come harder next time." The boy's eyes met Leora's, and she could see the unspoken truth in them. They weren't just running anymore. The Badlands had become a place where the chase could turn, and for the first time since the riders had found them, she felt a flicker of something sharp and dangerous in the giant's stance. It wasn't fear. It was readiness. They didn't move on until the sun dipped low enough for the Badlands' shadows to stretch like dark rivers between the ridges. And when they did, the giant cowboy kept them close to the stone walls, every step measured as though he knew each bend might hold a rifle barrel. The horse moved with quiet obedience, its reins loose in the boy's hand, while Leora walked just behind, her mind racing over the giant's words. Men paid to remind folks who owned the land. She wanted to ask why that meant her, why they'd ridden so far and fired so freely. But she kept her tongue until they reached a narrow saddle between two high cliffs, where the wind hissed through in a voice that seemed older than anything she'd known. There, the giant finally stopped, resting a hand on the rock as though feeling for something only he could sense. Then he looked at her, and for the first time since they'd met, his eyes held a crack of hesitation. "You deserve to know," he said, pulling off his wide-brimmed hat, the gesture slow, deliberate, revealing a long scar that ran from his temple down past his ear, disappearing into his collar. "My name isn't just Eli. Folks in these parts call me Eli Rourke, the Rourke who wouldn't sell." Leora frowned, the name half familiar, and he went on, voice low but edged with something hard. "My father's ranch sat on the richest water vein in the territory. When the companies came, they offered gold. He refused. They sent men, same kind as the ones today. One night, they lit the north field and shot him when he ran to save the herd. I buried him myself. Since then, I've been finding out where those men hide, and I've been making sure they don't sleep easy." The boy, who had been silent most of the day, finally asked, "And us? Why are they after us?" Eli's gaze didn't flinch. "Because you were seen with me, and because you, Leora, came into town asking questions about the old mill pond. That pond feeds into the same water vein they want." Leora felt the ground tilt beneath her, in a way that had nothing to do with the ridge's steep slope. She remembered the old man in town who'd told her about the pond, about how it used to run clear enough to see the stones at the bottom before the mining runoff turned it the color of rust. "So this isn't about me being—" She caught herself before saying it aloud, the words "too big" sour on her tongue. Eli's eyes softened, though his jaw stayed set. "No, Leora. That's the story they use to make sure you think it's your fault. Truth is, you're standing in the way of men who think the land and the water are theirs by right." They moved again, the conversation settling into the rhythm of their steps, but the air between them felt changed, heavier with understanding, lighter with trust. As they descended into a wider basin, the last rays of sunlight lit the red stone walls until they glowed, and for a moment, Leora thought she saw the place as it might have been before greed carved its scars. They found an overhang for the night, the horse tied where it could graze on the sparse tufts of grass, and Eli built a small fire, its glow pushing back the chill that pooled in the basin. Over the quiet crackle, he told them the next part of the plan. Not to keep running, but to cut across the basin to a canyon where the vein surfaced in a spring so pure you could drink without boiling. "It's where my father taught me to track," he said, and there was a note in his voice that Leora had not heard before, something like hope wrapped in grief. They'd rest until moonrise, then move under cover of darkness, trusting the stone and the shadows to keep them ahead of whoever might still be following. As she lay wrapped in her blanket, the boy already breathing steady beside her, Leora watched Eli's silhouette against the firelight, and thought that maybe the real danger wasn't in the men chasing them, but in the pull she felt toward the man who had chosen, against all reason, to lift her into his saddle when everyone else had only laughed. They left the basin under a moon that hung low and heavy, its pale light spilling across the stone like milk over red clay. And the silence of the Badlands was so complete that Leora could hear the soft crunch of the boy's boots and the slow, deliberate breathing of the bay as Eli led it. Every turn in the narrow pass seemed to pull them deeper into a place untouched by the world beyond. And though Leora's legs ached and her shoulders burned from the day's strain, she kept moving, matching the giant cowboy's pace, afraid to break the quiet with anything less important than breath. After an hour, the air changed, carrying with it a coolness that tasted of life. And when they rounded the last bend, the canyon opened like a secret held tight for generations. Before them lay a pool, fed by a ribbon of water spilling from a crack in the rock, its surface catching the moonlight so it looked lit from within. Eli stopped at the edge, his broad frame still in the shadows, and let the reins fall so the horse could drink. "This," he said, his voice low but carrying in the stillness, "is the heart of my father's land. Water so clean it remembers the first rains." Leora stepped closer, crouching to touch the surface, and the chill ran up her fingers like a promise. The boy cupped his hands and drank, his eyes widening at the taste, and Eli watched them both with an expression she couldn't read, something between relief and resolve. They didn't linger long, because Eli knew what the spring meant to the men who hunted them. It was the key to the land's worth, and once they realized where he was headed, they would come hard. But before they left, he filled every canteen, wrapping them tight in his saddlebag, and then he knelt beside the water, dipping his hand into it, letting it drip from his fingers in a slow, steady rhythm. "When my father died, I swore I'd keep this spring out of their hands, no matter what it cost me," he said, looking not at the water but at Leora. "Tonight I'm not swearing alone." The boy stepped forward without hesitation, placing his small hand in the pool beside Eli's, and after a long moment, Leora followed, her reflection trembling in the ripples. The cold bit into her skin, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she let the water bead and fall, feeling as though it carried away something she no longer needed. The shame, the weight of every whispered word about her size, every mocking glance. Eli's hand closed gently over hers beneath the surface, the contact solid and unhurried. "They mocked you because they feared you might see yourself the way I do," he murmured, the words so quiet she wasn't sure if the boy even heard. They broke contact at last, rising together, and in that moment, Leora understood that whatever lay ahead, she was no longer just someone he'd lifted into his saddle. She was part of the fight. They left the canyon before dawn, climbing a ridge that would take them to an old trail Eli claimed few remembered. From its crest, they could see the land rolling out in waves of shadow and silver, the town a faint smudge on the horizon. Leora felt no pull toward it now. Somewhere behind them, men would be waking to news of their failure in the Badlands, and somewhere ahead lay a day when Eli could ride back to this spring without watching the ridges for gunmen. The boy yawned, leaning against her side as they rode, and she wrapped an arm around him, holding him steady. The sun touched the farthest edge of the land with a thin line of gold, and Eli looked back once, as if measuring the distance between who they had been and who they were now. Then he faced forward, the bay's hooves finding a sure rhythm, carrying them toward a horizon that, for the first time, felt like it belonged to all three of them. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. If you found her chained there with that word burned into her skirt, would you have dared to cut her free?